Bacteria are often described based on their nutritional needs and special metabolic properties that they might have. They have a wide variety of metabolic properties and more diverse chemical reactions than a lot of other organisms. And so they can be classified based on where they get their food or nutrition from, their relationship to oxygen, like whether they need it or not, and then some special terms that relate to really unique metabolic processes or relationships with other organisms. And some of these terms that we'll talk about are used to describe lots of other organisms too. So while we're putting them in the context of bacteria in this chapter, we will see many of these terms in lots of other chapters as well. So for example, when we look at nutrition classification, we have the terms autotroph and heterotroph, and you hopefully remember these terms from when you learned about plants and animals and cellular respiration and photosynthesis in biology, in intro biology. So autotrophs are organisms that can produce their own organic compounds, and what we're really referring to in this case is food, right? So they're food molecules. Organic compounds are carbon-containing compounds. That's what that term means. So photoautotrophs, what you've learned about before is plants. Oops, sorry about that. They're an example of a photoautotroph. They use light as an energy source to connect carbon dioxide into sugars. So it uses CO2 and light to make sugars. There are bacteria that are also photoautotrophic and do photosynthesis exactly like that. So for example, cyanobacteria also do what plants do. There's some other bacteria that can use things other than carbon dioxide as starting material for building other molecules, and so we do see some variation in that. Chemoautotrophs use energy from inorganic compounds instead of light to produce their food. And so this is really unusual. This might be like deep in a dark cave, for example, where there's no other food sources and no light. And so there's a small number of bacteria that can do this. Heterotrophs are organisms that have to eat their food. So they have to access an organic compound from somewhere. They can't make it themselves. And usually they need more than just one organic compound. So we're a classic example of one of these. We're a chemoheterotroph. We must obtain all of our organic molecules, and we need that for both energy and as a carbon source to build our bodies. So we have extensive requirements to get food. Photoheterotrophs are a little bit interesting because they are able to use light energy, so hence the photo part here, but then they still have to intake organic compounds from the environment. So they have to eat and they need light energy. And again, this is more unusual and something we can see in some bacterial types. So bacteria vary in their relationship to oxygen. So organisms like us, so there's bacteria that are like us, they require oxygen. They're called obligate aerobes. So they must have oxygen in their environment. They have a critical requirement for it. And it's oftentimes, like us, a requirement for cellular respiration. Facultative aerobes can use oxygen if it's present, but they can also survive without it. So for facultative aerobes, they generally can use oxygen for cellular respiration, but if oxygen isn't present, they have some sort of alternative route to produce ATP. So for example, fermentation. Obligate anaerobes cannot tolerate any oxygen, so they don't use it, and it's also toxic to them. So they have some other way to do cellular respiration, and O2 harms them. So if they're exposed to oxygen, they die. So this was like the Clostridium bacteria that I was talking about before as an example of obligate anaerobe. You do have some aerotolerant anaerobes, they don't use oxygen for cellular respiration, so they don't need it. But on the other hand, it's not toxic to them. So they're able to exist in environments that have oxygen. Diazotrophs are a special type of bacteria that can carry out nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation is when they take N2 from the atmosphere and are able to convert it into usable forms. So most organisms, ourselves included, cannot use nitrogen from the atmosphere. So while nitrogen is abundant in the atmosphere, we literally cannot absorb it. So you and I are constantly breathing in nitrogen from the air, but we breathe it right back out. You could be dying from lack of nitrogen and you would not be able to get it from air, even though there's tons of it in the air that you breathe. Instead, all living things require this rely on this chemical reaction that just a small number of bacteria can do. And so that's why they're a really special group, because they make all of the usable nitrogen on Earth for all other living things. One example of a diazotroph is called rhizobium. They're interesting because they actually live in the roots of plants like peas and beans. And so they're making usable nitrogen for the peas and beans. In other words, they're basically living fertilizer for the peas and beans. They're fixing nitrogen and making it available for the peas and beans. And this is why these types of crops, legume crops, are known for improving soil. Because they have these bacteria living with them, they can actually increase the nitrogen present in the soil. So we talked about bacteria that are carrying out photosynthesis. So a special term for organisms that are doing this is they're also called producers. And the reason why is because any photosynthetic organism is generally generating food for other organisms as well. So for example, we rely on photosynthesizers for our food. So they're the producers for our ecosystem. We're the consumers. So it's the opposite of consumer. And these terms generally line up with autotrophs and heterotrophs. Another related role is a decomposer, also called a saprobe. These are organisms that can't produce their own food, but they break down dead organisms or waste. And so they contribute to the recycling of carbon in an ecosystem. So they have a sort of special role there. Some bacteria also have a really specific distinct relationship to carbon in that they either make methane or eat methane. So methanogens make methane and methanotrophs eat methane. These are significant because methane is a greenhouse gas, which means it contributes to global warming or climate change. And so the presence of methanogenic bacteria in the intestines of cows, for example, is contributing to climate change. And if we have methanotrophs, they can help consume some of that methane. So theoretically, they might be able to help with climate change. So bacteria and other organisms are also classified based on their relationships with other organisms. So a symbiotic relationship is when organisms live in close association with each other. And so that can generally be a beneficial symbiotic relationship, and that's sometimes called a mutualism. And then parasitism is when there's a benefit to one organism, but it's harming the other. And so bacteria participate in both mutualistic relationships with many organisms and parasitic relationships with many organisms. So, for example, there's worms that have to have bacteria that provide their food, so they have no gut, no digestive system. They're entirely dependent on bacteria for that. There are eukaryotic organisms that have to have bacteria for their development. And And if you look at us, we actually have a microbiome rich in bacteria. So our gut, our skin, that are helping us. Sorry, my cat is on my lap. In our gut, the bacteria are helping us digest food. On our skin, it's helping to break down dead skin cells and to keep our skin healthy. So we have a lot of beneficial relationships with bacteria as well, or these mutualistic relationships with bacteria. They also can have beneficial relationships with each other. So I mentioned biofilms before. In biofilms, you usually have bacteria that produce the biofilm, and then that benefits everybody else. So you have multiple types of bacteria that are dependent on each other within that biofilm. And then parasites are organisms that are harming the partner. So you have a host that's harmed by the parasite. So pathogenic bacteria, pathogenic means to cause disease. And so pathogenic bacteria can include things like streptococcus, which is the cause of strep, staphylococcus, which is the cause of staph infections. Those are two of the most common. You can have E. coli infections of certain strains, though most E. coli are not harmful. And so there are a lot of different bacterial pathogens. One thing that people don't realize is that there are also plant pathogens. So there are bacteria that make plants sick, and this is an example of a gall, which is an infection in a plant. So they are also affected by bacterial parasites. However, I do just want to point out that for the most part, the things that are infectious, so this is a table of infectious disease. Globally, so this is from WHO, the World Health Organization data, that when you look at the global infectious disease load, a lot of it is actually viruses. So measles, hepatitis, most of the diarrheal diseases, AIDS, HIV, pneumonia, influenza, they are viral, not bacterial. So there's a noticeable exception here of tuberculosis, cholera is bacterial, tetanus is bacterial. But again, I just want to highlight here that the majority of bacteria, first of all, are not pathogenic. They're not parasites. And second of all, that a lot of our infectious disease challenges globally are due to viruses, not bacteria.